At 6:47 in the morning on November 15th, 1942, Lyudmila Pavlichenko lay motionless in the rubble of a destroyed apartment building in Stalingrad, her body covered in brick dust and snow that had fallen during the night. She'd been in this exact position for 23 hours and 47 minutes. Her fingers were numb inside her gloves. Her lips were cracked and bleeding from the cold. Her right eye, pressed against the scope of her rifle for nearly 24 hours, saw the world in a narrow circle of magnified reality. Through that circle, 780 meters away, she watched a German Hauptmann emerge from a command bunker, his breath visible in the freezing air. He was cautious, scanning the ruins, aware that 26 of his fellow officers had been killed in the last 24 hours by a sniper no one could find. He took 3 steps from the bunker entrance toward a communications trench. Lyudmila exhaled slowly, half a breath, emptying her lungs. Her finger tightened on the trigger. The Mosin-Nagant rifle kicked against her shoulder, the sound sharp and flat in the cold air. Through the scope, she saw the Hauptmann's head snap back, saw him fall. 27. Behind her, a male Soviet soldier who'd been watching through binoculars for the last 6 hours whispered in a voice filled with awe and disbelief. "That's impossible. That's absolutely impossible." But the bodies scattered across the German lines, 27 officers dead in 24 hours, told a different story. And the rifle that had done it, the weapon that male soldiers had mocked as a tiny civilian hunting rifle, lay smoking in the hands of a 19-year-old woman they'd said would be dead in an hour. She'd been in position for 24 hours. She'd fired 27 shots. She hadn't missed once. Lyudmila Mikhailovna Pavlichenko was born on July 12, 1916, in Bila Tserkva, a small town outside Kiev in what was then the Russian Empire. Her father, Mikhail Pavlichenko, worked in a factory. Her mother, Elena, was a teacher who believed education was the only path out of poverty. Lyudmila grew up in a household where books were treasured and questions were encouraged. She was a serious child, quiet, observant, the kind of girl who watched everything and said little. When she was 15, a shooting club opened in her town, offering free marksmanship training as part of a Soviet program to prepare citizens for national defense. Lyudmila joined out of curiosity. Her instructor gave her an old Mosin-Nagant rifle, a bolt-action weapon that had been used in the First World War and looked like it. "This is a basic rifle," the instructor said. "Nothing fancy. But if you learn to shoot with this, you can shoot with anything." Lyudmila learned. She had a natural talent for marksmanship, a combination of steady hands, excellent eyesight, and an almost supernatural patience. While other students got bored waiting for the perfect shot, Lyudmila could lie motionless for hours, waiting, watching, breathing. By the time she was 17, she could hit a target at 500 meters with iron sights, no scope, just her eye and the rifle, and an understanding of wind and distance that seemed instinctive. Her instructor told her she was the best shooter he'd ever trained. She didn't think much of it. It was just something she was good at, like math or memorizing poetry. In 1937, she enrolled at Kiev University to study history. She wanted to be a teacher like her mother, wanted to spend her life with books and students and ideas. She kept shooting as a hobby, competing in local competitions, winning most of them. She met a man, a fellow student named Alexei. They married in 1938. She had a son in 1939. Her life was ordinary and good, and exactly what she'd hoped for. Then, on June 22, 1941, Germany invaded the Soviet Union. Within weeks, Kiev was threatened. The university closed. Alexei joined the Red Army and was sent to the front. Lyudmila, 25 years old with a young son, stood in her apartment and made a decision. She could stay home, wait for the war to come to her, hope that someone else would protect her family, or she could fight. On June 25, 1941, Lyudmila Pavlichenko walked into a Red Army recruitment office in Kiev carrying her grandfather's Mosin-Nagant rifle and said, "I want to fight." The recruiter, a middle-aged sergeant with tired eyes, looked at her the way you look at a child who'd asked to drive a tank. He saw a woman, 5'3", maybe 110 pounds, holding a rifle that looked like a museum piece. He said not unkindly, "We need soldiers, not children. Go home. Take care of your family. That's how you help the war effort. I can shoot, Ludmilla said. I've won regional competitions. I can hit a target at 500 meters. The sergeant sighed. I'm sure you're very good at target shooting. But war isn't a competition. It's men trying to kill you. You'd be dead in a day. Go home. Ludmilla didn't argue. She just said, thank you for your time, and left. She didn't go home. She went to front anyway. She traveled to the outskirts of Kiev where Soviet forces were digging defensive positions, and she found a unit that was too desperate and disorganized to turn away anyone who could hold a rifle. A junior officer, overwhelmed and exhausted, looked at her and said, You know how to shoot that thing? She nodded. Fine. You're in. Try not to die. That was her entire enlistment process. By October 1942, Ludmilla had been fighting for 16 months. She'd been at Odessa, at Sevastopol, at a dozen nameless villages and fields where Soviet and German forces tore each other apart. She'd killed 282 enemy soldiers, each one recorded in a small notebook she kept in her coat pocket. She'd been wounded twice, once by shrapnel, once by a bullet that grazed her shoulder. She'd watched friends die, watched cities burn, watched the war grind through human lives like a machine that never stopped. And through it all, she'd carried her grandfather's Mosin Nagant, the rifle that officers kept telling her to replace with something more appropriate. She never did. The rifle was par her now. She knew its weight, its balance, the exact pressure needed on the trigger. She knew that it pulled slightly left at distances over 600 meters. She knew that the bolt stuck in cold, whether unless you worked it with a specific motion. She knew this rifle better than she knew most people. In November 1942, she was transferred to Stalingrad, the city that had become a symbol of the entire war, a frozen hellscape where Soviet and German forces fought building by building, room by room, sometimes separated by a single wall. She arrived at the front lines on November 10th and reported to her new commanding officer, Major Konstantin Petrov, a man who'd been fighting since the first day of the war and looked like he'd aged 20 years and 16 months. Petrov looked at Ludmilla, looked at her rifle, and said, What is that? Mosin Nagant, sir. 1891 model. That's a civilian hunting rifle, Petrov said. It doesn't even have a proper scope. Where is your military-issue weapon? This is my weapon, sir. I've used it for 16 months. 282 confirmed kills. Petrov stared at her. 282 kills with that? Yes, sir. He shook his head. I don't care what you did before. This is Stalingrad. The Germans here aren't farmers or rear-echelon troops. They're veterans. They have counter-snipers, artillery, air support. You'll be dead in an hour with that antique. He said it as a statement of fact, not an insult, just the reality of Stalingrad. Ludmilla said quietly, Then give me an hour, sir. Petrov, certain she'd either die or run back to the rear, assigned her to a forward observation post in the ruins of a tractor factory. If you survive until sunset, we'll talk about getting you a real rifle. She took position at dawn on November 11th. By sunset, she'd killed 8 German soldiers. Petrov stopped talking about getting her a different rifle. What the male soldiers didn't understand, what Petrov didn't understand, was that Ludmilla wasn't just a good shot. She was a scientist. She approached sniping the way a mathematician approaches an equation, as a problem with variables that could be calculated and controlled. She kept a notebook where she recorded every shot: distance, wind speed, temperature, humidity, angle, result. She studied ballistics, read German manuals on marksmanship that had been captured and translated. She learned that bullet trajectory wasn't a straight line, but a curve affected by gravity, air resistance, wind, even the rotation of the earth at extreme distances. She learned that temperature affected powder burn rate, which affected muzzle velocity, which affected impact point. She learned that her tiny civilian rifle had advantages that military sniper rifles didn't. The Mosin Nagant was lighter than the specialized sniper variants, which meant she could move faster, reposition more easily. The shorter barrel made it better for urban combat, where shots were often taken at angles through windows or around corners. The lack of a heavy scope meant she could acquire targets faster, didn't have the tunnel vision that scope rifles created. And because it was a common rifle, used by millions of Soviet soldiers, ammunition was everywhere. She never had to worry about finding the specialized rounds that sniper rifles required. She adapted her tactics to her weapon instead of complaining about what she didn't have. While male snipers waited for perfect conditions, no wind, good light, stable positions, Ludmilla took shots in wind, in snow, in darkness, in conditions they said were impossible. And she hit, because she calculated the variables, adjusted for the conditions, and understood that perfect conditions never existed in war. On November 14, 1942, Ludmilla attended a briefing at a Soviet command post in the basement of a destroyed school. Major Petrov and 3 other officers stood around a table covered with maps and reconnaissance photographs. Petrov pointed to a section of the map. German 389th Infantry Battalion has established a command post here, in the ruins of School No. 7, approximately 800 meters from our forward positions. The battalion is well-led, disciplined, and effective. They've repelled 3 of our attacks in the last 2 weeks with minimal casualties. Intelligence indicates they have at least 30 officers coordinating their defense. One of the other officers, a captain, said, "We need to disrupt their command structure. Kill enough officers and the battalion falls apart. But the position is heavily defended. Every sniper we've sent has either failed or been killed by their counter-snipers." Petrov nodded. "We're considering an artillery strike, but we can't spare the shells. We need another option." Ludmilla, standing in the back of the room because there weren't enough chairs, studied the reconnaissance photographs. She could see the German command post, a reinforced bunker built into the basement of the school. She could see the entrance, a narrow doorway with sandbags. She could see the sight lines, the distances, the angles. She said quietly, "I can do it." The room went silent. The officers turned to look at her. Petrov said, "You can do what?" "I can eliminate their officers, disrupt their command structure." The captain laughed, not cruelly, just disbelief. "Pavlichenko, you're good. We know you're good. But this isn't 8 soldiers in a day. This is a fortified command post 800 meters away with counter-snipers actively hunting for threats. You'd need to kill at least 20 officers to seriously disrupt their operations. That would take days, maybe weeks, and you'd be exposed the entire time. "Give me 24 hours, Ludmilla said. Petrov stared at her. 24 hours? To kill 20 officers. "At least 20, Ludmilla said. "Probably more." The officers exchanged glances. One of them said, "That's impossible. No sniper in history has killed 20 targets in 24 hours at that distance." "Then I'll be the first," Ludmilla said. Petrov studied her face, looking for bravado or delusion. He saw neither, just calm certainty. Finally, he said, "If you think you can do this, I won't stop you. But I won't send anyone with you. This is your operation. Your risk." "I understand," Ludmilla said. "When do you want to start?" "Tomorrow morning, 7 a.m. Ludmilla spent the afternoon of November 14th scouting positions. She needed a location with a direct line of sight to the German command post, close enough for accurate shooting, but far enough to avoid detection. She moved through the ruins of Stalingrad like a ghost, studying angles, measuring distances with a rangefinder she'd taken from a dead German officer. Most of the good positions were too exposed, too obvious, places where German counter-snipers would look first. She needed somewhere unexpected. She found it in the ruins of an apartment building 780 meters from the German command post. The building had been hit by artillery. The top 2 floors collapsed into rubble, but the 3rd floor, partially intact, had a window that looked directly at the German bunker entrance. It was a terrible position in most ways. No roof, exposed to the sky, no escape route if she was discovered. But it had one critical advantage. The angle was wrong for a sniper position. The window was too high, the sight line too steep. German counter-snipers would be looking for threats at ground level or from buildings with better cover. They wouldn't expect someone to shoot from a position that was tactically inferior. That's why it would work. She returned to Soviet lines and prepared. She cleaned her rifle, checked every mechanism, loaded 50 rounds of ammunition into stripper clips. She filled a canteen with water. She didn't bring food. Eating would mean moving, and moving would give away her position. She didn't bring a blanket or extra clothing. She wore her standard uniform, a coat, gloves, and a fur hat. At 6:30 p.m., she visited the field hospital where her son was being cared for by a nurse while Ludmilla fought. She held him for 10 minutes, memorizing his face, his weight, the sound of his breathing. She didn't say goodbye. Saying goodbye would mean admitting she might not come back. She just kissed his forehead and left. At 6:45 a.m. on November 14th, Ludmilla Pavlichenko moved through no man's land in the pre-dawn darkness. Crawling through rubble and frozen mud, her rifle strapped to her back. It took her 45 minutes to cover 200 meters. German flares occasionally lit the sky, and she'd freeze, pressing flat against the ground, waiting for the light to fade. At 7:30 a.m., she reached the apartment building. She climbed to the third floor, moving slowly, testing each step to avoid making noise. She reached the window, positioned herself in the rubble, and settled in. Through the window, 780 meters away, she could see the German command post. The bunker entrance was visible, a dark rectangle of sandbags and reinforced concrete. She checked her rifle, adjusted her position, and began to wait. For the first 3 hours, nothing happened. No movement at the bunker. No targets. The cold seeped into her body, starting in her fingers and toes, spreading slowly through her limbs. She ignored it. Cold was just a variable, like wind or distance. It affected her, but it didn't control her. She controlled her breathing, slow and steady, keeping her heart rate low. She blinked regularly to keep her eyes from drying out. She shifted her weight every 30 minutes, tiny movements that kept blood flowing without changing her position. At 10:17 a.m., the bunker entrance opened. A German lieutenant, a lieutenant, emerged. He was young, maybe 25, wearing a clean uniform and an officer's cap. He stood in the entrance for a moment, looking at the sky, breathing the cold air. 3 seconds. Ludmilla had 3 seconds before he moved into cover. She placed the crosshairs on his chest, adjusted for wind. Light breeze from the east, maybe 5 kilometers per hour, adjusted for distance, 780 meters. Bullet drop approximately 2 meters. She exhaled halfway, held it, squeezed the trigger. The rifle kicked. Through the scope, she saw the lieutenant jerk backward, saw him fall. 1. Chaos erupted in the German lines. Soldiers shouted, ran to the fallen officer, dragged him inside. She heard whistles, commands, the sound of a machine gun being repositioned. They knew there was a sniper. They didn't know where. She didn't move. She lay in the rubble, motionless, watching. For the next hour, nothing happened. The Germans were cautious now, aware of the threat. At 11:43 a.m., another officer emerged, an Oberleutnant, a first lieutenant. He was more careful than the first, moving quickly, scanning the ruins. He had maybe 2 seconds of visibility before he reached cover. Ludmilla tracked him, led him slightly, fired. He fell. 2. More shouting. More chaos. The Germans sent counter-snipers to find her. She watched them take positions in buildings across from the command post, watched them scan the ruins with binoculars and scopes. They were looking in the wrong places. They were looking at ground level, at buildings with good cover, at positions that made tactical sense. They weren't looking at a half-collapsed apartment building with a bad angle and no escape route. At 2:34 p.m., a Hauptmann, a captain, stepped out of the bunker. He was older, more experienced, moving in short bursts, using the sandbags for cover. But he had to cross an open space, just 3 meters, to reach a communications trench. 3 meters, maybe 2 seconds. Ludmilla waited until he committed to the movement, until he was in the open with no cover. She fired. 3. At 4:56 p.m., another Oberleutnant. 4. At 6:23 p.m., a major, a higher-ranking officer, someone important. He emerged with 2 bodyguards, using them as shields. She waited until the bodyguards moved, creating a gap. 1 second. She fired. 5. By sunset, she'd killed 9 officers. The German battalion was starting to panic. Officers were dying, and no one knew where the shots were coming from. Ludmilla had 18 more to go, and 12 hours left. Night fell over Stalingrad. The temperature dropped to -15 Celsius. Ludmilla couldn't leave her position. Moving would create noise, would leave tracks in the snow, would give her away. She stayed, lying in the rubble, her body slowly going numb from the cold. She couldn't feel her toes anymore. Her fingers were stiff inside her gloves. She flexed them regularly, forcing blood into them, keeping them functional. She needed her fingers. Without them, she couldn't shoot. The Germans, thinking the sniper had left, became less cautious. At 8:45 p.m., they lit fires near the command post for warmth. The firelight illuminated the bunker entrance, creating shadows and contrast. At 9:12 p.m., an officer stepped out, silhouetted against the flames. Perfect target. She fired. 6. The muzzle flash from her rifle gave away her position. For a fraction of a second, her location was visible. German machine guns opened fire immediately, tearing through the apartment building, bullets smashing through brick and concrete. She pressed herself flat against the floor, covering her head with her arms. Bullets snapped overhead, so close she could feel the displacement of air. Chunks of brick and plaster rained down on her. The firing lasted 30 seconds, then stopped. Silence. She didn't move for 2 hours. She lay perfectly still, barely breathing, waiting to see if they'd send soldiers to investigate. They didn't. At 11:37 p.m., another officer emerged, thinking the sniper was dead or gone. She fired. 7. She stayed awake through the night by reciting poetry in her head, poems she'd memorized in university. Pushkin, Lermontov, Akhmatova. She did math problems, calculating trajectories, wind drift, bullet velocities. She thought about her son, about holding him, about the way he smiled. She thought about anything except the cold and the exhaustion, and the fact that she'd been in this position for 16 hours and still had 8 more to go. November 15th, 6 a.m. Dawn broke over Stalingrad, gray and cold. Ludmilla had been in position for 23 hours. She'd killed 11 officers. Her body was shutting down. Her hands shook uncontrollably. Her vision blurred from exhaustion and dehydration. She had 1 hour left in her self-imposed deadline. 16 more officers to kill. It was impossible. She was going to try anyway. The Germans, realizing their officers were being systematically eliminated, changed tactics. Instead of sending officers out one at a time, they sent them in groups, hoping the sniper could only kill one before the others escaped. At 6:04 a.m., 3 officers emerged together, running for a vehicle parked 30 meters away. Ludmilla fired, killed the first, worked the bolt, ejecting the spent casing, chambering a new round, fired again, killed the second. The third officer was almost to the vehicle. She led him, calculating his speed, his trajectory. Fired. He fell 5 meters from the vehicle. 8, 9, 10. At 6:19 a.m., for officers tried to run from the bunker to a communications trench. She fired 4 times in 8 seconds. Killed 3. 11, 12, 13. The fourth made it to the trench. She waited. He'd have to emerge eventually. At 6:27 a.m., he tried to run back to the bunker. She killed him on the threshold. 14. The German battalion was in chaos. 14 officers dead in 23 hours. Junior officers were terrified to leave the bunker. Enlisted men were refusing orders because there was no one left to give them. The battalion's operations had ground to a halt. At 6:31 a.m., a German Oberst, a colonel, the battalion commander, emerged from the bunker. He was older, maybe 50, with gray hair and a face that had seen too many wars. He moved in short bursts, using cover, never exposing himself for more than a second. He was good, experienced, careful. Ludmilla tracked him through the scope, waiting for the moment he had to cross an open space. There, 3 seconds. She fired. 15. The colonel fell. With him died the last semblance of command structure in the battalion. At 6:38 a.m., a major tried to escape through a back entrance that Ludmilla had been watching peripherally. She swung her rifle, acquired the target, fired. 16. The Germans sent smoke grenades, trying to obscure the bunker entrance. Gray smoke billowed across the position, hiding everything. Ludmilla waited. The wind was from the east. The smoke would clear. At 6:42 a.m., the wind shifted, creating a gap in the smoke. An officer ran through the gap, thinking he was hidden. She fired blind, aiming at where she knew the entrance was, calculating where a running man would be. The officer fell. 17. At 6:47 a.m., 5 officers made a desperate run for a trench 50 meters away. They ran together, hoping that numbers would save them. Ludmilla fired 5 times in 12 seconds. 5 officers fell. 18, 19, 20, 21, 22. Her shoulder was bruised from the rifle's recoil. Her hands were bleeding where the cold had cracked her skin. She didn't care. She kept firing. At 6:51 a.m., 3 more officers tried to escape. She killed all 3. 23, 24, 25. At 6:54 a.m., 2 officers ran from the bunker toward a vehicle. She killed both. 26, 27. Her 24 hours were up. She'd exceeded her goal. 27 officers dead. The German command post was silent. No one else emerged. There was no one left. Ludmilla extracted from her position at 7 a.m., moving slowly through the ruins, her body barely responding to her commands. She'd been motionless for 24 hours, and her muscles had locked up. Every movement was agony. She crawled through no man's land, dragging her rifle, no longer caring if she was seen. She was too exhausted to care. She reached Soviet lines at 7:15 a.m., stumbling over the trench lip, collapsing into the arms of soldiers who'd been watching her position through binoculars. Major Petrov was there. He'd been watching for the last 6 hours, counting bodies through his binoculars, not quite believing what he was seeing. He knelt beside her and said, 27. You killed 27 officers in 24 hours with a hunting rifle. Ludmilla nodded, too exhausted to speak. A medic examined her, treating her for frostbite on her fingers and toes, for dehydration, for exhaustion. He wanted to send her to the field hospital. She refused. She just needed water and sleep. They gave her both. She slept for 16 hours straight. When she woke, intelligence reports were coming in. The German 389th Infantry Battalion, leaderless and demoralized, had retreated from their positions during the night. Soviet forces had advanced, taking ground that had been contested for weeks. 1 woman, 1 rifle, 27 bullets. The entire tactical situation had shifted. The story of Ludmilla's 24-hour operation spread through the Soviet forces like wildfire. Soldiers who dismissed her tiny civilian rifle weren't laughing anymore. They were asking her to teach them, to explain how she'd done it. Officers who told her to get a real rifle were studying her tactics, trying to understand how she'd achieved something that military doctrine said was impossible. Ludmilla didn't enjoy the attention. She just wanted to do her job. But the Soviet propaganda machine had found a hero, and they weren't going to let her go. She was photographed, interviewed, written about in newspapers. Lady Death, they called her. The most dangerous woman in the Soviet Union. The Germans called her something else. Captured documents refer to her as the ghost of Stalingrad, a sniper who appeared from nowhere, killed with impossible accuracy and vanished. German soldiers were terrified of her. Some units refused to operate in sectors where she was rumored to be active. After Stalingrad, the Soviet High Command finally offered Ludmilla a proper military sniper rifle, a Mosin Nagant with a PU scope, precision manufactured, the best weapon the Red Army could provide. She used it for 3 months. Then she went back to her grandfather's rifle. When asked why, she said simply, I know this rifle. It knows me. We've been through too much together to separate now. By the end of the war, Ludmilla Pavlichenko had 309 confirmed kills, making her the most successful female sniper in history. But the November 15th operation remained her most famous, the one that military historians still study, still debate, still struggle to explain. 27 officers in 24 hours at 780 meters with a 40-year-old hunting rifle in sub-zero temperatures. The odds against it were astronomical. She did it anyway. In 1943, Ludmilla was pulled from combat and sent on a propaganda tour to the United States and Britain. The Soviet government wanted to show the world that Soviet women were fighting and die alongside men. Ludmilla hated it. She hated the speeches, the photographs, the questions from journalists who'd never seen combat. But she did it because she was ordered to. In the United States, she met Eleanor Roosevelt, who became a friend. She spoke at rallies, at universities, at factories. American audiences were fascinated by her, this small, quiet woman who'd killed 309 men. Some were inspired. Some were horrified. She didn't care. She just wanted to go home, to see her son, to stop being a symbol and start being a person again. After the war, Ludmilla returned to Kiev and finished her history degree. She became a historian, researching and writing about the Soviet experience in World War II. She trained Soviet snipers, teaching them the techniques she developed, the calculations and patience and understanding that turned shooting into science. She never spoke publicly about the men she'd killed. When asked about it in interviews, she'd say, "I did what was necessary. They were invading my country. They would have killed me and everyone I loved. I don't regret it, but I don't celebrate it either. War is not something to celebrate." She married again after the war, to a man who understood her silences, who didn't ask about the nightmares. She had a quiet life, the kind of ordinary existence she wanted before the war interrupted everything. She died on October 10th, 1974, at the age of 58 from a stroke. Her funeral was attended by hundreds of people, veterans, students, historians, people whose lives she touched. The Soviet government gave her a state funeral, buried her with military honors. But the most remarkable tribute came from an unexpected source. A letter arrived at the Soviet embassy in Bonn, West Germany, a week after her death. It was from a German veteran named Klaus Hoffmann, who'd fought at Stalingrad as a young lieutenant in the 389th Infantry Battalion. The letter said, "I am writing to express my condolences on the death of Ludmilla Pavlichenko. I fought against her at Stalingrad in November 1942. I was one of the junior officers in the battalion she decimated. I watched 27 of my superior officers die in 24 hours, killed by a sniper we couldn't find, couldn't stop, couldn't even see. We called her Lady Death. We feared her more than we feared artillery, more than we feared tanks, more than we feared anything else in that terrible city. She was invisible, unstoppable, and absolutely merciless. After the war, I learned who she was, learned her story. I want you to know that she was the best soldier I ever faced. She was brave, skilled, and utterly professional. War made us enemies. History should remember her as a hero. I am sorry for your loss. The world is lesser without her." Today, Ludmilla Pavlichenko's rifle is displayed in the Central Armed Forces Museum in Moscow. It sits in a glass case, carefully preserved, looking exactly like what it is, an old Mosin-Nagant hunting rifle, the kind that millions of Soviet citizens used before the war. It looks small. It looks inadequate. It looks like something a grandfather would use to hunt deer, not something that would kill 309 enemy soldiers. Until you read the plaque beside it. The plaque says, Mosin-Nagant rifle, 1891 model, used by Senior Sergeant Ludmilla Pavlichenko. 309 confirmed kills, including 27 enemy officers eliminated in 24 hours on November 15, 1942, at Stalingrad. This weapon was dismissed by male officers as a tiny civilian rifle unsuitable for combat. It became the most feared weapon on the Eastern Front. Never underestimate the weapon. Never underestimate the woman. Every year, on November 15th, veterans gather at the museum to commemorate the anniversary of Ludmilla's 24-hour operation. They stand in front of the rifle, these old men and women who remember Stalingrad, who remember the cold and the fear and the impossible things that ordinary people did to survive. They tell stories about her patience, her precision, her absolute refusal to accept that something was impossible just because men said it was. They talk about the way she changed the battle, the way one woman with an old rifle shifted the tactical situation and saved countless Soviet lives. And they remember the lesson she taught, the lesson that's written on the plaque beside her rifle. Never underestimate the weapon, and never, ever underestimate the woman. Because Lyudmila Pavlichenko proved something that the world keeps forgetting and keeps needing to relearn. She proved that the deadliest weapon isn't always the biggest or the newest or the most expensive. Sometimes it's the one that nobody takes seriously, wielded by someone everyone underestimates, until the moment when underestimation becomes fatal. She proved that a tiny civilian rifle in the hands of a woman who understood ballistics, patience, and precision could kill 27 officers in 24 hours and change the course of battle. She proved that being dismissed, being mocked, being told you're not good enough, doesn't mean anything except that the people dismissing you don't understand what you're capable of. The German officers who laugh at reports of female snipers stopped laughing when their colleagues started dying. The Soviet officers who told her to get a real rifle stopped talking when she outperformed every male sniper in the army. The world that said women couldn't fight, couldn't kill, couldn't be soldiers, had confronted the reality of 309 bodies and a quiet woman who said, "I did what was necessary." Lyudmila Pavlichenko didn't fight to prove a point. She didn't fight to break barriers or challenge stereotypes. She fought because her country was invaded, her people were dying, and she had a skill that could save lives. The fact that she was a woman, the fact that her rifle was too small, the fact that men dismissed her, none of that mattered to her. What mattered was the shot, the calculation, the patience, the result. What mattered was that when she squeezed the trigger, the bullet went exactly where she intended. Everything else was just noise. And in the end, that's the lesson of Lyudmila Pavlichenko. Not that women can fight as well as men, though she proved that beyond any doubt. Not that old weapons can be as effective as new ones, though she proved that too. The real lesson is simpler and more profound. Never let anyone else define what you're capable of. Never let dismissal become truth. Never let mockery become limitation. Because somewhere right now, there's a woman holding a weapon that men call inadequate, preparing to do something that everyone says is impossible. And when she succeeds, when impossible becomes real, the only question that will matter is, why did anyone doubt her in the first place? Lyudmila Pavlichenko knew the answer, because they always do, and she knew something else. Their doubt was their weakness, not hers, and that weakness killed them.